Kia ora tātou everyone, and welcome to this edition of InFocus, a TLA podcast. I'm your host Michael Andrew, and each episode we will be sitting down and talking to an inspiring guest connected to the legal sector, listening to their stories as they share their experience, and in the process explore some of the significant work that is being done behind the scenes that impact the industry and our communities. Kia ora everyone, and welcome to InFocus, the Law Association's podcast. Our guest today is someone very special and important to the Law Association. She is firstly our Vice President and also convener of the Criminal Law Committee and one of the most respected criminal law barristers in New Zealand. She is the admirable and formidable Julie-Anne Kincade KC. Julie-Anne, thanks so much for joining us and coming into the studio today.
Thank you for this opportunity.
No worries. And how's your week been? Busy before Christmas?
Yes, Christmas is always a busy time, as all criminal lawyers would know. In fact, I'm sure all lawyers. But for us, it's all about bail variations, everybody needing to do different things around Christmas time. And if they're on quite stringent conditions, we have to get everyone to agree that they can maybe go to a different place. Or there's a lot of that going on, as well as preparing for next year's trials.
Yeah, interesting. So it's just a case of kind of wrapping things up before everything kind of shuts down for a while.
Yes, although with my junior's going to be working right through this holiday, and she's just been away in Europe on a lovely trip. But for the courts, there's usually somebody around any day to do emergency things.
Yeah, fair enough.
Particularly bail applications.
Yeah. Well, we've spoken on a number of occasions, and I've always enjoyed talking with you. You're, in fact, my favourite lawyer to speak with, not only because of your eloquence, but because of your accent, which I find very charming. I'm a big fan of Puff and Rock. I don't know if you watch the show, but my daughter loves it. It's an Irish cartoon.
That must be a new one. I'll look out for it.
Yeah, it's fantastic. But anyway, no, I really enjoy talking with you because you always have such a fresh take and you have such a knowledgeable perspective on your field, which I guess has made you such a respected criminal lawyer. So yeah, it's great speaking with you today. But I guess what we really want to know first and foremost is a little bit about your backstory. You know, you've obviously come to New Zealand from Ireland. What was your formative years like before you got into law? Like, take us back to Julie-Anne, the child, and what sparked that inspiration, I guess, to get into this career of yours?
Well, I grew up in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, in the 70s and 80s, and that was, for anyone that may not be aware, a very lively time in Northern Ireland. There were a lot of bombs and what we call euphemistically the Troubles. It was essentially a civil war, and yet my family and lots of families around us were all just trying to get on with normal lives. But it was far from normal. As a child, though, any child growing up anywhere, that's all they know, so they think it's okay and normal, and it really wasn't until I left home that I realised how abnormal it was to live, getting searched all the time and under such, having armed police officers, soldiers in the streets. Everybody had big guns, and it was just not a fun place to grow up because when we were a child, all the things we could do were quite limited. We had a lot of YMCAs and things like that if you were into physical sports, but apart from that, we didn't have a lot of the other things that people would be used to growing up. We didn't have McDonald's or anything. Because they didn't want the bad publicity of having had a bomb there. And there were a lot of bombs when I was a kid, and you became quite used to it in an unusual way. Being a lawyer now, I was reflecting on this today, that one of the things was I didn't really want to be a lawyer. I didn't know much about it. I didn't know other lawyers. I don't come from a family of lawyers. And in Northern Ireland, where you have this civil unrest, the law seemed very remote. There was a lot of sort of martial law, but it was quite arbitrary. And how I was brought up was basically just to try and stay away from the police and stay out of any contact at all, because the idea was if you came into contact with that world, you'd get sucked into, and it was not going to end well. So I didn't really understand how how it would be to live in a place where the rule of law was paramount. And when I moved to England and first saw a completely different type of policing, a completely different type of society, I was really mesmerised by it. I thought this is how people really should live. And it really has left me ultimately with a very profound passion for the rule of law and how important it is and how precious it is. We can see in other countries now where maybe some of the leadership don't have the same respect for the rule of law. Rights are being eroded, and I think it's quite frightening, scary for those societies, because it is only the rule of law which binds us really into a civilization. I'd like to tell a little story about this. If
Please
I might.
do.
You can
yeah.
edit out later if you like.
No, do it.
When I was in London, we had a talk given to us by Chris Patten, who you may remember was the last governor of Hong Kong. And he is a career politician, and he came to the Bar Council and gave us a bit of a talk, and he's a very entertaining speaker, but he talked about the fact that as a career politician he'd always believed that democracy was the cornerstone of freedom. But his time in Hong Kong, a place where there wasn't democracy, he realised that in fact that was wrong, and really the cornerstone of freedom is the rule of law and the respect of the rule of law. And to say that I was so moved by him saying that maybe sounds a bit extreme, but I think it's very easy to live in a beautiful country like New Zealand and take these things for granted. And until we live in other environments, other countries where the rule of law has been given less respect, as it was for me growing up in Northern Ireland, or for Chris Patten when he went to Hong Kong, there's different types of societies, you realise how crucial it is for people to understand that there is a law, there are rules, they apply to everybody the same, whether you are the lowest of the low or whether you are in leadership, doesn't matter. The rule of law applies to everybody. Yeah,
that's such a fascinating perspective. And did you decide early on, when you had this kind of observation of the lack of rule of law where you were living, that you wanted to be a lawyer, or did that develop as you went to university?
It definitely came later, because in Northern Ireland it wasn't a place where I saw that there was any great example of respect for law and order. It was a very unruly, lawless place where everybody seemed to have their own sets of rules. Everybody was doing deals with other people. It was very confusing to know who was actually in charge and where the power lay. And generally it lay with men who had guns, whichever society you were in. Because you could live in a housing estate and that would be run by the paramilitaries, where the police wouldn't even go in there. So, it was a strange and lawless place in many ways. So it wasn't until I got to England I began to embrace how a society can work if everyone understands that there are rules, they apply the same to everybody, and that you can have this much fairer place to live in.
Yeah.
And so it came later.
Yeah, makes total sense. And so when you completed your studies, how did your early career evolve? What did you do in terms of your field you practiced in, and how did it develop from that early stage?
Well, I didn't really want to do law, but my family wanted me to, so I was quite a disgruntled young person who was being financed by my family, so I did as I was told.
As we all are these days.
So I and then in my first year I quickly discovered how wonderful it was. I had great lecturers. I studied with wonderful people who I'm still friends with today, and it was actually other students, in fact one student in particular, who really encouraged me to think that I could become this strange thing called a barrister. I'd never met any barristers in my whole life, and even by the time I went to bar school still had only met a handful of barristers. But I did like the idea of a job where you could talk for a living. That seemed very attractive to me. And I really loved criminal law. Criminal law is my passion. If I wasn't a criminal lawyer, I don't think I'd actually be a lawyer. I love being in a courtroom. I love trial advocacy. I love jury trials. And so all of these things came together. Perhaps my family knew me better than I realised, that I was able to then go on and do something which I love. I'm very, very privileged for that reason.
So your family must have had the same perspective that you did about the importance of the rule of law if they were encouraging you to be a lawyer.
I think so. I was quite an argumentative child, so I think that's a difficult child, as they would have said. And I think that they could see that I did have a very strong sense of fairness. Everything was about fairness, and I didn't like to see injustice. So I think maybe they could see those things in me and see where it could push me. They also wanted me to do law because they thought it was a good degree to do. And there's a lot of people that study law, obviously, and they don't go on to become lawyers. And I thought that would be me until, as I say, another student persuaded me to go to bar school, and off I went there. And I thought I'd give it a crack for a little while, see how it went.
Do you know that every person we've had on this podcast has said the same thing, that they love to argue? And that's one of the biggest factors in their career choices, which is, makes a lot of sense.
It's an outlet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Saves our friends and family from having to be subjected
to
all the...
They love to talk and they love to perform. So
there's definitely, I sometimes say before I go into court, lights, camera, action. There is an element of... And the other aspect is on a more serious thing. I do explain to my clients that I'm quite different in a courtroom than I am in my day-to-day life. Yeah. Because otherwise, I wouldn't have any friends.
Put on a character.
Yes,
wow.
There is a definite court person that I have. If you like, a cloak or a manner that you bring into the courtroom, because you have to be... you have to really hold the room, I think, in a way, which you don't want to do that. If I at a party or something, it'd make you very unpopular very quickly.
Clients are like, why isn't she smiling at me in the courtroom?
Well, and I say to them, when we go in there, you'll see. Yeah. And it's about a level of expectation that I have as well about how other people will treat me when we're in the courtroom. That's our workplace, if you like. Yep. Once you leave the courtroom, that persona can come off and we could just be normal people again. But in the courtroom, you have to amp it up a bit. It takes a bit of energy. And
this is probably something that you've learnt over many years, right? You don't start in criminal law or law in general with this knowledge of how to assume this character and basically put on this cloak, right? Tell me a little bit about your skill development over the years and what were the biggest challenges, and I guess how you perfected your craft.
I actually love telling people this, that when I was a baby barrister in London, I used to pop up to the Old Bailey all the time with, the Inns of Court are very close, and it was my favourite thing to go up there and watch if I knew particular barristers, who were famous back in the day, Ronnie Thwaites and so on, were going to be there. I'd go up, my own head of chambers, Dick Ferguson, is very charming, he had his own style, and I'd watch all of these different, generally men. There weren't very many women at the senior level at that stage, but there were a couple. And I'd like to watch them all, though, and see all of their different styles. One of the things that I noticed they all had in common was that when they were addressing either the judge or the jury, they were very still. And if they moved their hands or their body, they used their whole body, as it were, in their advocacy. And if there was a movement, it was to emphasise something. And whilst they all had very different styles, and you've got to be yourself, you have to have an authenticity to who you are. You also have to remember that for these poor 12 jurors, they just have to watch you, especially when you're doing a closing address, for example, it might be a couple of hours. And so that everything you're doing is to persuade them without going too high, if you like. It's got to be realistic and authentic, as I say. Those are important things. But as I watched these really good advocates, those were the lessons that I was able to learn from them.
It's so fascinating, right? I mean, I've watched a lot of lawyers either through video link or in court, and I'm always amazed by the eloquence with which they deliver whatever they're trying to, because they do so with such precise number of words. There's very few superfluous words in there, and as a journalist, that's always what you're aiming for. So I'm always just like, that must take so much practice to get right, because not only are you being watched by so many people and you're under this pressure, but you're basically, there's a lot at stake depending on, the case and the client. So you have to do that under enormous pressurized circumstances. Did that take you a while to develop as well?
I can't remember exactly the year, but I did a big case early on with Sasha was leading me, and one lawyer had been cross-examining this person for like 2.5 days, and it was really dull. And on he went anyway, and Sasha said to me, "Watch this, I'm going to ask 6 questions, count them," as she stood up. And I sat there, wide-eyed and in awe of this amazing woman. And she asked 6 questions, and she achieved what she needed to achieve in 6 questions. And that, to me, as I watched that, I thought that's the best advocacy. So for me, 1, I don't want to go to court at all if it can be avoided. 2, if you have to go to court, I don't want to actually say anything when I'm in the room, if that can be avoided, because the point being, you've sorted it all out before. It's all worked out beforehand. 3, if you do have to speak, everything you say is of value. And so the judge, particularly your relationships with the judges, are important. They know that if you're speaking, you're saying something, they're going to listen to you because you're not a waffler, you're not wasting their time, you get straight to the point, you tell them what you want to do, ask them, say what you're needing to ask of them that day, and you seek to persuade them, as you say, as eloquently as possible, without wasting time. There's nothing more annoying than sitting in court, listening to somebody who's not prepared properly, who's making it up as they go along. I find that really frustrating.
Yeah, waffle away. That's the nemesis of the editor, in my opinion,
And sometimes lay clients can listen to somebody waffling and not realise that actually it's to their detriment.
Yeah.
And so I do explain to my clients before a trial, for example, especially if I know somebody else, another lawyer in the trial's a bit verbose, I'll say, listen, when we get in that courtroom, this is my tactic, this is what we're doing, it's a plan. I'm not going to say that much. These are the witnesses we're cross-examining, this is the goal. So you always have an eye on the end point.
Yeah.
That it's not just thinking of something, the first thing comes into your head. And I think as long as they understand that, and so they don't mistake the verbose lawyer as someone who's fighting more for his client. That's what they sometimes can think it looks like.
Yeah, other than the kind of altruistic social benefits that you must get from what you do in terms of representing your clients and, delivering the sense of justice or fairness, there must be a very compelling personal development aspect to what you do in terms of like, okay, I'm going to get really good at this, at this skill, much like acting or anything really. But, it strikes me as like, okay, I'm going to go and nail it if I go into this case and this courtroom. I'm going to do so well. And it's like, I don't know. That's me personally. If I was in your position, I would be really testing myself to do better and better every time. Is that how you operate? I
don't know, because every case is different and your objectives are different. So I don't know if I have thought particularly in those terms. I am a big fan of continuing professional development. So I give a lot of talks. I teach a lot. I also attend things. So I just think you're always learning, definitely, as a lawyer, as anybody. You should always be learning and trying to get better at whatever we do, just in a very general sense. And I love to watch good advocates in court, even if they are on the other side. I can really admire good advocacy. And I will say to an opponent, that was fantastic afterwards, if it's merited, even if it's a heated case,
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's something we should all do, be able to do, is admire good advocacy when we see it. So I do try, and one of the reasons I love teaching is because you always learn from teaching, and so I do quite a lot of that as well.
Great, yeah. Let's go back to the timeline again. So you finished university, you started practicing, you're building your career, and at what point did you make the transition to New Zealand, and why?
I had been a lawyer in London, I think, about 13 years. I'd have to check the years. But I certainly lived in London about 13 years, so maybe I'd actually been working there 12 or so. But anyway, I met a Kiwi, so that's why I'm here. We got married and have kids here. And so I've always had a point in my life, though, that I didn't mean to really stay living in London. That happened by accident. And so I'd been doing a couple of cases up in Manchester, and I was pretty sure that if I hadn't been moving to New Zealand, I probably would have moved back up north, because I studied up there, and I'm very fond of Leeds and Bradford and all those places, which I visited this year for the first time in a long time, and it was just joyous.
Yeah, great.
If wet.
Oh, yes. And what was that transition like, going from practicing in London to coming to little old New Zealand and a whole different...
It's quite humbling, actually. Yeah. It's humbling to move countries, because I was doing okay in London. My last cases mainly were at the Old Bailey. They were big, high-profile cases there, and I just got to quite a good point in my career there. So to some people, they were surprised that I said I'm off to New Zealand. And the thing I love to say is, more than once, people said to me, "You can't go to New Zealand, there's no crime there." I said, there's plenty of crime. Which sounds like an odd thing, but if you're a criminal lawyer, it's something that was said to me quite a lot.
Yeah, there's just hobbits there that don't commit any crimes.
Well, in those days, I came in 2006, so 2005, they didn't even know about the hobbits. That was still to come. Yeah, so I said, don't worry, there's plenty of crime, it'll be fine. But the humbling thing about it is you go from being somebody to being nobody again, and nobody knows you, and none of the judges know you, so anyway, I arrived here. You have to requalify, which is really boring.
Really?
Yes.
I would have thought it would be like you're a big fish coming to a small pool, and everyone would be like, whoa, just come out of London.
Well, I mean, maybe... So my story is this is what the tale has become, that I arrived, and I'm a relative of mine, fortunately for me, a relative of my husband, knew John Billington. And so I spoke to John, we had coffee, and he said, send me your CV. So he sent it to Simon Moore, who was in charge of Meredith Connell at the time, and also to the head of the PDS back then. And I always say I'm still waiting to hear back from the PDS. But Simon rang me the same day, and we had a chat on the phone, and then I suddenly had a job at Meredith Connell. More or less, I had to go through an interview process. But and he did talk to me about London, and he knew some of the people I'd worked with, and also some of the other people who interviewed me knew other barristers that I'd worked with. So it wasn't irrelevant what I'd come from in London. But the humbling thing is you're still, fresh off the boat and having to learn things. The system here is very similar, but you can get caught out on the differences. And so it was important for me to just sit quietly for a couple of years and make sure that I understood the way things were done here.
It sounds like Simon Moore has a talent for spotting talent, because at his valedictory session, a lot of people talked about how he gave them their big break, and he spotted, they were like the first kind of entry into law. It was through him at Meredith Connell.
Unquestionably, he's warm and generous. He was supportive to us as young lawyers. We always felt very supported by him, as I think Robin mentioned, his incredible letter writing skill. And I was fortunate to receive a letter from him yesterday, which, as usual, nearly made me cry, because he's so lovely, the way he's generous of how he expresses himself. So, and he supports people throughout their career. As I think. And what I had said to him privately was, he set the best example for us as Emma and I in our chambers now are trying to emulate some of the habits that he ingrained in us, and that some of the customs from Meredith Connell back in the day that we had there. One of the things that we do in Augusta, that we did at Meredith Connell, we had a thing called Eddie the Eagle, where on a Friday evening everybody sat around a big table. We were supposed to be talking about the work that was happening next week, but there was an Eddie the Eagle prize for the person who'd made the biggest muck up in the week, and it was an encouragement for people to go, oh God, I did this and I made a mistake or I mucked up, so it gave you this atmosphere where it was safe to talk about mistakes, which I think is crucial for lawyers.
Yeah.
And it was okay to talk about, one, the mistake happened, how you sorted it out. That's where the lessons are, especially for young lawyers.
Probably a lot of stigma around making mistakes, right?
Yes, of course. And as lawyers, we're all pretty alpha people that we like to be perfectionists, and to admit that you'd made a mistake is huge. So I think it was actually a wonderful, casual environment to be able to just talk about things that went wrong and this happened and then I didn't know what to say or whatever the thing was, to be honest and open and admit how things can sometimes go awry, and also then to talk about how that could be fixed, to have those discussions. They're so important.
Yeah. So you came to New Zealand, you had to start from scratch essentially. Well, not from total scratch, but you had to re-qualify, you had to re-network, re-establish all those things that I guess fundamental for a successful practice. How did you go about that? You've obviously thrived doing that over the last 20 years. But how did that go for you? And after Meredith Connell, where did you go from there?
Yeah, no, New Zealand is a wonderful country to come to as an immigrant. People are welcoming and warm. Certainly it's my experience. People in New Zealand are very well travelled, so they love to talk to you about where you're from and all your background, and I found that really charming. And so I felt really lucky to come here, actually. And I think then I wanted to work within an organisation, so I didn't want to go to the bar straight away because I didn't know anyone and I didn't know how that would be. But I wanted to work either within Meredith Connell or, because there was no other alternative in Auckland at that time, or the PDS. So anyway, I got a job at Meredith Connell, and that way I was able to meet lots and lots of wonderful people, of course, and I loved my time there when I worked there. And then what happened was I had a couple of children, and when I was on maternity leave with my second child, an old colleague of mine in London called David Hislop won a case in the Privy Council, which meant there was going to be a retrial here in New Zealand in a pretty large case. And he asked me if I would work with him on that case. And I said, well, to defend the person. I said, well, at the minute I'm work for the Crown, so I'd have to resign first. And that was how I came to leave Meredith Connell. So I went on maternity leave with my second child and never went back, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we should talk about your recent work as well, because that's very important. You were in Samoa recently, and that seemed like it was a very eventful trip. Can you tell me a little bit about, you already talked about the backstory and how it was kind of a miracle in terms of pulling funding together and getting people on board, and you didn't have a lot of time. But you guys pulled it off, right? So obviously a success. Yeah,
I really have to give 98% of the credit to Elaine Ward, who with other people, not so much me, but she had a team, but Elaine was tireless in getting funding, which was not easy. But eventually she managed to do that. So we were able to get a wonderful team together of judges and lawyers and go to Samoa and run a litigation skills course for 3 days there. Elaine had done it the year before with a different makeup, so it was a little bit different the year that I did it with her. But it was an amazing experience.
Yeah. And so it's obviously really important because Samoa and a lot of the Pacific Islands look to New Zealand for those resources and that kind of mentorship, right? And they require a self-sufficient legal system. And so these skills that you were teaching them are really important to, I guess, equip those barristers with what they need in order to represent clients with, I guess, the latest skills and knowledge.
Yeah, look, I think there's a number of reasons why work like this is important. One point is that we have, of course, many Samoan colleagues here in New Zealand. Second Samoa is how I heard it described when I was there. And there are a lot of people that go back and forth between here and there. And they have families and colleagues. So having a robust legal system, which works well and is efficient in Samoa, I think has a knock-on effect to benefit people here in New Zealand too. One area which we are looking at trying to really work more with next year, there's a real drive, is in family law. And I'm a criminal lawyer, so we taught criminal litigation skills, but those are transferable over into other areas of law. But if we are able to get funding to go in 2025, we would like very much to have a greater focus on family law and how it works in family courts. We've got family judges who are willing to come. I'm sure we'll find some family lawyers easily enough. But certainly from the Samoan side of things, that's what they really want from us as well next year.
Very cool. And you were also involved with a schools program rolling out kind of legal career advice, I suppose, to high school students, showing them that law is a viable pathway and it's relatively accessible, right?
100%. So there is a perception of lawyers and judges that we live in ivory towers and that we're all from really, posh backgrounds and so on. And I am really keen to dissipate that idea as far as we can. We talk about access to justice. Access to justice generally means people being able to feel that they can go to lawyers and get advice and, if necessary, go to the courts. And that's very, very important. But if you think a lawyer lives in a whole different world from you, there's a lot of people that think that they don't think of going to lawyers. They think it's going to be too expensive, it's going to be too difficult, and it's really not for them. And I really want to get rid of that idea as much as possible in society. So for me, that means two things. One is that the people feel that they understand that those of us who are lawyers and judges, we're ordinary people from quite difficult circumstances sometimes who have really struggled to achieve where they've got to, and that should be something that's broadcast as much as possible. And secondly, that we want to encourage young people to feel they can become a lawyer. So I don't want anyone to think at any school or from any background that that's not for them, as certainly I even thought. And I come from a relatively, an okay background. It's certainly not as hard as some of the other backgrounds that some of my colleagues have come from. And so it's really important that we went to an intermediate school, Manurewa Intermediate, which is a fantastic school. I don't know if you know anything more about Manurewa Intermediate, but I have a friend that works there, and we were able to set up a couple of judges coming from Manukau District Court to speak to the students there, 2 different occasions. Judge Moala and Judge Varapori spoke on 2 different occasions, and it was excellent. And the main lesson that you're trying to get across is that they talked about their own background and how they came to be lawyers and now they're judges, and how they never thought that really they could do that, but they've done it.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is the perception, I guess, that lawyers are in it for the money, or
Yes.
It's a generational thing. My dad was a lawyer, so I'm a lawyer, and there's like a family kind of
That happens.
dynasty. Yeah, I'm sure it happens as it does in every career. But in my experience, every lawyer I've spoken with has always referenced some really deep and long-standing kind of social mission as a main purpose in what they do in their career. Whereas for journalists, you ask a journalist why they do what they do, and they say, because it's the only thing I was ever good at, was writing. So it's just default. But there's quite an admirable sense of purpose with the law. And in your case, obviously, and other people we've spoken to on this podcast, what you experienced in your childhood has an enormous effect on what you're doing today. And that's quite special,
Yes, it's a privilege, I think, to be able to have a job. People talk these days about sense of purpose in your work, but it is a privilege. And I know a lot of people that do jobs, they don't have that privilege of a sense of purpose. And I would like to say I think you're doing journalism a disservice, because you're the 4th pillar of democracy.
That's true. Yes,
it's a really important role that you play in our society.
Yeah.
And just as I talked about the rule of law being under threat, it concerns me that journalism is under so much threat here in New Zealand as well as all over the world. And where will we be when we can only turn to social media?
We'll get AI to write the stories.
Yeah. And then we'll all just live in an echo chamber and never learn anything new. So journalism is really important.
Yes. Well, that's good. I feel better about what I do now.
And you're good at writing.
Yeah. It is interesting when you speak with lawyers and, there seems to be, it's like the front line of our democracy almost. I mean, journalism is really important as the fourth pillar, but upholding the rule of law has just got such a kind of profundity to it, I think.
It does, and it's particularly important, when doing criminal law, that we're representing people that are outliers in our society, and it would be very easy to look at them and say, that's a different person to me. They're nothing to do with me. Their lives are nothing to do with me. But that I again have a fundamentally challenge that idea, because we need to live in a society where, again, the rules of law apply to everybody, but that also means that our sense of fairness, having a fair trial, applies to everyone. And so when somebody commits a particularly heinous crime, it's quite easy to say to the lawyer, how can you do what you're doing? I get that quite a lot. How can you defend people? And the point is, because we have to ensure that the process that they are subjected to is fair. And that fairness applies to everyone, just as it would be to you or I or any of our family if they were sitting in the dock. And it happens, it happens that our loved ones find themselves in trouble, friends and family, and you would expect them to have that protection of our rule of law, just as everyone in society is protected by it.
Yeah, and I guess when someone is sentenced, that fairness is playing out, right? Because you've heard arguments on both sides, all the facts have been assessed, and where the decision falls, that's that fairness manifesting. So it is fair at the end of the day, even though people would be like, hearing someone's argument if they've done a heinous crime isn't fair. You should be just listening to the other person. But it all evolves in the way you want it to.
There's a lot to be said for victims' rights and them having a voice in the process, and I don't argue with that. But sometimes when I read things in the paper, I can see that there's been a mismatch, a misalignment about how the process works. People say, well, that sentence was ridiculous, whatever. But the point, the sentences may not be the one that the victim or the family of the victim wanted, but it's been the judge's function, which is a difficult function. If you ever watch a sentencing process, it's a very complex and difficult function that the judge has to balance a lot of different factors. Every single case at the end of the day is unique and needs to have the judge using all these checks and balances and taking into account a myriad of factors. And the victim's views are one of them. They're important, but they are not decisive. And that's otherwise we end up in a situation like Iran, where the victims decide what happens, whether the person is executed or not, whether enough money has been paid or not.
Even if the victim's not a victim, we've had Samira talk about.
Yes,
we see some of the things that go on there, and it's very egregious.
Yes, and I don't mean to sound extreme. People might think, that will never happen in New Zealand, but we need to be careful to understand how easily this balance that we hold is fragile, and if it tips too far in the wrong direction, that will lead to unfairness. Yeah,
absolutely. Let's talk quickly about your appointment to King's Counsel, which is obviously a massive evolution. And did you, when you were back at university and your friend was persuading you to take on law, did you ever see yourself being a King's Counsel in little old New Zealand?
I think, I can't believe I live in New Zealand. It's amazing and wonderful. And I certainly never saw myself being a King's Counsel. It's extraordinary to me. Even now when I see my name written down, sometimes it's a surprise to see that.
And how has that changed your career in terms of the work you do? Has there been a change? Has it meant more work? Has it meant an increase in the intensity of work?
When I received the appointment, my first reaction, which is this sounds ridiculous, was a fear and how it might change things. And then then we went into COVID basically, so I had time to acclimatise to the whole thing. The reason I applied though is I did want to do a different type of work that is not only done by KCs but mainly done by KCs, and that has happened. So it's giving advice to ministry and things like that, which I really, really enjoy.
Yeah.
And so I did want access to a different type of work that, as I say, is generally the work of KCs.
You're like more of a change maker, like at that you can kind of wield more influence.
Well, I have to say I was perhaps a little naive about how much difference it has made. And somebody else once said to me, another KC, it means you never have to explain who you are. And I think that's part of it, that, you know, if I go into a room full of people that don't know who I am, you know, lawyers, whatever, you do have more mana, kudos, whatever, than you might have otherwise had just going in as little old yourself. But I am still myself.
Yeah.
And that's important to me. I don't like pomposity. I don't like arrogance. And I would hope that I don't display those characteristics too frequently.
No.
Try not to. People would say that you know where you are with me, because I do express my mind quite openly. But I hope I'm not pompous or arrogant. And so I dislike if people want to be a KC because it'll add to those characteristics that they may already have. I think that's not the best reason to do the job. I do believe that it's about leadership. It's about giving back. It's the committee work I do and the work with the Law Association that I do. I would do all of that anyway. But I feel now as a KC it's even more important to keep doing that type of work.
Yeah. And when you submit, say, on a piece of legislation, people listen. Yes,
I do think that and sometimes I involve myself in things, and it's a little bit like help with the Samoa thing, is that you know when you're going to look for funding, that is part of it. And people say that to me. So people we're talking to for funding, they say, we are interested in it because you're involved in it. And I understand it's not so much about me, perhaps personally, but it's about this mantle that I carry with me. It can lend an air of respect to a project, and that's a real privilege to be able to encourage things that you want to see more of.
Yeah.
Be the change you want to. What does that say?
Yes.
Be the change you want to see.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so what does the future hold for you? Will you be a judge one day?
I don't know about that, but I'm a busy person, and with committee work I have 2 children and running a house, and we run our chambers, and I run Augusta Chambers, which is a great place to work. And so there's always so many things happening. And so I just know, I get up in the morning, I think, right, what is today? And I work out what I'm doing that day. And that's my main focus. I have learned the lesson of living in the present moment. That's an important lesson, I think, in life. So
you probably have to, right? I mean, you can't dwell too much on plans of the future because you're, like many of us, but probably way more, you're juggling so many balls in the air that it just pays to stay focused on your work and not get carried away with.
Career-wise, I feel very lucky to be in a place where I really want to be. I'm doing professional work that I love, and also doing the committee work and the voluntary side of things, which is so rewarding. I call it my hobby, but I think it's much more than that, and it's a privilege to be able to give back into a profession, which is given to me, and so I'm trying to just repay that, paying it forward.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for chatting with us. It was fantastic. So interesting to hear about it all and sharing that beautiful chronology about your career. It's great to hear what you've been doing and your mission and your purpose, and you can definitely see it in your work and, talking with us today. So really appreciate you coming in.
Thank you. It's been a real privilege to take part in my very first podcast. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I've very much enjoyed this series, Michael. I enjoy listening to you. And thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode. Subscribe to InFocus, a TLA podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you'd like to connect with the Law Association, follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, X or Instagram, or visit our website, theLawAssociation.nz. Mā te wā.